guys, and welcome back to another Mystery Monday video on my channel. Today's case that we are going to be talking about is one that has been requested so much since I first started my channel. It is probably the case that I have been requested to cover the most. And it wasn't just by one person consistently, it has actually been requested to be covered by multiple people. And the reason that it took me so long to actually cover this case is because it is so big and it is so well known. And you guys know that I try to not cover very well known cases on my channel just because I don't want to keep repeating things that you guys already know about and things that are too often covered on YouTube. But because this case was requested so often and because it does fit so well with the topics that I do talk about on this channel, I decided what the heck, and I'm gonna do it anyways. So today the case that we are going to be talking about is the Dyatlov Pass incident. Now, if you guys have been following my channel for a while, then you know how much I struggle with the pronunciation of certain names and things like that. And a lot of the names in this case are Russian, so please bear with me through that. But with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. In early of 1959, a group of very experienced skiers and hikers headed out in a group of 10 people to hike up the northern Ural Mountains. Now, this group was being led by a 23-year-old by the name of Igor Dyatlov. And just a couple weeks into the trip, a young man by the name of Yuri Yudin actually fell ill and he had to return home. Now, what exactly he fell ill with is not clear, but it was so severe that he had to abandon the trek and head back to his home where he could recover and get better. Before Yuri headed out to head back home with his illness, Igor had told him that the estimated time that they were believed to have arrived at the base would have been around February 12th, and that when they did arrive at the base to which they were hiking towards, they would send back a telegram to the university to inform everybody that they arrived there safely. But when February 12th came and went and nobody had heard from the group, they actually weren't too worried because, again, this was just an estimated day of arrival. And as you guys probably know and as you can probably see and think about, it is very, very hard to estimate how quickly you're going to hike. So it wouldn't be too alarming if they arrived there either a few days beforehand or a few days afterwards. So this just wasn't too alarming when they hadn't arrived exactly on February 12th. But when February 20th came and nobody had still heard from any of these skiers, that is when the loved ones of this group of 9 skiers became worried. And they actually contacted the university and asked them to send out a search group. And the university did just that, but unfortunately they found zero trace of any of these skiers. And they had no idea now where these 9 missing people were. Now, once the university had failed to find any trace of these 9 skiers, the loved ones and families of these 9 missing people actually reached out to the government. And that is when the FBI got involved, and they used all of the technology that they had at that time to search the mountains for these people, including helicopters and very, very large search groups. On February 26, 1959, they finally came across the group of skiers' tent. Now, it was hitched up on the side of Kholat Syakhl. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a mountain, and I will put the name of it here so that you guys can see it because I'm probably pronouncing it awfully. But they did come across the skiers' tents there, and the tent was there and it was pitched up, but it was extremely damaged and not in very good shape and appeared like it was completely abandoned. The person who had first come across the tent said that it was in really, really bad state as half of it had been torn down and was full of snow. The hikers' belongings were still inside the tent, but the tent had been slit open from the inside, suggesting that whoever had made the cut inside the tent had to leave so quickly that for whatever reason they couldn't just use the normal door. Another strange thing about this is where the hikers had actually set up their campsite was really on a weird angle. They said that it was really like slanted, so the tent was on a slant, so it almost looked like it could have slid down the hill if it wasn't intact correctly. But underneath where the tent was set up, there was actually a wooded area. So it was like a large forest area at the bottom of this slant where the hikers and skiers decided to set up camp. After coming across this campsite, they also realized that there was footprints leading away from where the skiers had set up their tent down towards where the forested area was. Now, these footprints in themselves were very, very strange because some of them appeared like they were made by somebody who didn't have any shoes or socks on. Some of them appeared to be made by somebody who only had socks on, and one of them appeared to be made by somebody who was wearing a shoe on one foot and a completely bare foot on the other. So these these footprints in themselves were quite strange to the people who had first discovered them. Searchers were able to follow these footprints for about 500 miles before they were completely buried by snow. But while following these footprints, it actually led them to the first group of bodies. These were the bodies of 23-year-old Yuri Korvanchenko and 21-year-old Yuri Doranchenko. Now again, these are Russian names and I am probably butchering them, but I will again insert the names of all of the skiers and hikers on the screen at some point. The temperature on the night that these two men were believed to have passed away was anywhere from -13 to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. But despite this fact, both men were found completely naked except for in their underwear. Now, there was a fire pit nearby that appeared as if the two men had tried to start a fire or did successfully start a fire sometime before their death. And something else to keep in mind here is, this is going to come into play a little bit later on with the theory, so just remember this, is they were found in the wooded area, so they were surrounded by many tall trees, and all of the trees surrounding these men's bodies, from the ground up to about mid-range within the tree, all of the branches had been completely broken off, which is pretty strange. But some people say that they believe that this could be because maybe the men had tried to actually climb the tree, but just again keep that in mind because that will come into play with the theories a little bit later on in the video. Between the forested area and the campsite, 3 other bodies had been discovered. These were the bodies of 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, 24-year-old Zanita Klomogrova, and 23-year-old Rustem Slabin. Now, because of where these 3 bodies had been discovered, it suggested to investigators that it was likely they were headed back towards their campsite when they passed away. And all of these 5 people who I have mentioned this far all passed away due to hypothermia. Another thing to keep in mind that isn't super relevant to this case, but is something that I saw quite a lot mentioned, so I do want to mention it here just to give you all of the information that I can, is that the last 3 people who I mentioned were found deceased were found quite spread out, whereas the first 2 people whose bodies were discovered were found quite close together. Now, although because they were in the mountains, passing away from hypothermia doesn't seem too strange, but it is pretty odd considering they had all of the means to start a fire, which would have kept them warm, and they wouldn't have passed away due to hypothermia if they hadn't left the tent. So that brought up a lot of questions within this case. But something else to keep in mind here is there was absolutely 0 signs of any external damage done to these people, except for that which was caused by the cold. Searchers had a very hard time discovering where the remaining missing 4 skiers were, and it actually took them 2 whole months to discover these 4 missing people's bodies, which is kind of odd considering that they were all together and somehow ended up so spread out. But this is where the case takes a very, very strange turn and starts to get really, really unsettling. Now, the reason that searchers had such a hard time finding these remaining missing 4 people's bodies is because of how deeply they were buried under the snow. They were actually discovered 75 meters into the wooded area, around where the other bodies had been discovered, but for whatever reason, this group of bodies ended up completely buried. They were buried so deep in the snow that you couldn't even see them, like when you were walking around and walking by, which is why it took searchers so long to discover their remains. These were the bodies of 24-year-old Alexander Kolvatov, 23-year-old Nikolai Brindogles, 20-year-old Lamila Dabinmina, and 38-year-old Sivan Zoltarov. Now again, like I mentioned earlier, Russian names, I have a very hard time with pronunciation, especially in this case, so I will put their names on the screen. Alexander, just like the other group of people, had actually just passed away from hypothermia, but the other 3 people who had been found deceased is what actually makes this case so strange. Nikolai had been discovered to have severe skull damage that appeared as if it was inflicted just moments before his passing. Semyon had been discovered with such severe chest fractures that it was compared to that of a really, really bad car accident, because in order to have such severe fracture on the chest, it would take a lot of immense force being put on your chest to cause such a severe fracture, similar to the one that was found when Simon's body was discovered. But Ludmila's injuries were actually much more severe than that, and they were super shocking. She had chest fractures that were almost identical to that which was found on Semyon's body, but her tongue and eyes had been cut out and were now completely missing. She had also been missing part of her lip, some of her facial tissue, and a part of her skull bone. Weirdly enough though, similar to the first group of bodies that had been discovered, most of the injuries inflicted on these 3 people were also all internal, and most of the injuries that were external were caused by the cold. This group was actually much better dressed than the first group of deceased bodies that had been discovered. Ludmila was actually discovered wearing Korovenchkoto's pants wrapped around her ankles, and Semyon was actually found wearing Ludmila's coat as well as her hat, suggesting that maybe they had taken them off their bodies once they were deceased. It appeared that the skiers had actually abandoned their camp by their own accord, and their footprints leading from the camp down to the wooded area were studied immensely, and it was determined that they had actually left their campsite very calmly and with intent, as if they knew exactly where they were going. There was zero evidence to suggest that anybody had been on that campsite or even on that side of the mountain at the time of the skier's death. And actually, scientists who studied this case said that it is pretty much impossible that any of these injuries that were found on the deceased skiers could have possibly been inflicted by another human being, which means that murder was completely ruled out pretty much right off the bat. It was also determined that the skiers passed away 6 to 10 hours after their last meal, meaning that it was likely that they died between 12 to 2 a.m. Another strange thing in this case is that the state of the skiers' organs was never released to the public, which is very strange because most of the information in this case was released to the public, so why not that? Something else that struck me as odd is that the loved ones of the skiers said that when they got their bodies back, all of the skiers' bodies appeared to have an orange tinge to them and their hair appeared to be gray. Now, scientists explained this by saying that they were buried pretty deep under the snow, and that could have had an effect on the color of their skin as well as their hair. So now that you have a gist of this case, I'm going to jump right into the theories. And because this case is so large and so unexplainable, as you can probably imagine, there are so many theories in this case that I couldn't possibly cover every single one of them. And because I did want to cover a good amount of theories in this case, I'm not going to be diving too deeply into every single one of the theories that I talk about. I'm pretty much just going to be brushing the surface of all of these theories that I think were interesting. But if you guys have any other theories on this case, or you want to explain more of why you believe one theory over the other ones, please feel free to do so in the comments, because I love to read that stuff, and I'm sure a lot of you guys like to read other people's theories and thoughts on these kinds of cases as well. The first theory that I'm going to talk about is one that is probably one of the most largest believed theories in this case, and it does involve a cryptid. Now, the reason I think this is so interesting is because usually in cases like this, people are looking for the most reasonable theory, and often people don't think that cryptids are a very reasonable theory, but in this case, this seems to be one of the more popular ones, and that is that the skiers were killed by a mink. Now, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's M-E-N-K, and it is basically the Russian version of a yeti. Many people who strongly believe this theory really focus on all of the damage that was done to Ludmila's face. And they really dive in to talk about why they think that the mink would have done this and how that could have been possible, because the scientists who did study her injuries said that it is very unlikely that, again, another human being inflicted these kinds of wounds. But something else that goes along with this theory is that there was actually a photo found on Alexander's camera, and it is famously known as frame 17. Now, in this photo, you can see what appears to be some kind of large creature in the background of this photo, and to me, honestly, it holds a lot of resemblance to Bigfoot. A lot of people who have seen this photo also say that they believe that it is just one of the hikers who maybe walked away from camp for a little while and was now returning back to camp, trying to get their footing and their bearings of where they are. But regardless of what is going on in this photo, as you can see, it is quite eerie looking. Another strong theory in this case that a lot of people believe, which I myself don't personally believe, but I did want to mention just because of how many people do believe this is what happened, is that the skiers fell victim to an avalanche. Now, the reason that I personally don't think this is the case is because the area in which these skiers had been camping and where they set up camp has had zero history of an avalanche ever happening there, both before and after this strange incident. Also, the searchers who discovered the skiers' bodies said that there was zero evidence to suggest that an avalanche had happened. There was no signs to suggest that this is what was going on. But when the bodies were newly discovered and they were looking for something to give the public, this theory was really pushed by both media as well as the cops and everybody who was involved in this case. They really pushed an avalanche, probably because that is the only really reasonable explanation that could have possibly happened in this case. But again, there's just zero evidence to back up this theory, but a lot of people do believe that this is exactly what happened. And of course, we can't leave out the possibility that this might have had something to do with extraterrestrials. Now, I feel like a lot of people try and chalk up cases like this to aliens, something people really push, but in this case, I think that it is kind of believable due to the fact that, again, when the first bodies were discovered, the trees above them had all been broken, and many people speculate that this may be due to the fact that maybe some kind of UFO was hovering over their bodies, or was hovering over the area in which their bodies were found. Maybe that's why they'd walk down there. Maybe there had been some kind of strange lights and they walked down there to see what was going on. But something else that kind of suggests some kind of alien involvement is the injuries that were found on the last 3 victims were said to actually have been have some surgical elements to them. And as you know, if you're really into alien abductions and things like that, a lot of the things that, or a lot of the injuries that are related to speculated alien abductions do have a lot of surgical elements to them, similar to those that were found on the last 3 victims' bodies in this case. The next theory that I'm really going to just brush the surface of is that the skiers somehow fell victim to an escaped prisoner from the Gulags region. Now, many of the prisoners who were being held in the Gulags region at this time were still being held there since World War II. So a lot of the people who were being held there may not have been in their right minds. They weren't all there and could have possibly thought that they were still in war. But the reason that I'm brushing so lightly on this and not diving too deeply into this theory is because, again, the scientists who studied this case really hard, and even people today who really study this case, say that it is extremely unlikely that any of these deaths were inflicted by another human being. So to me, this just doesn't seem too believable, and I'm not going to dive into it too deeply for that reason. Next theory goes kind of hand in hand with the last one, and that is that maybe the skiers were murdered by the Gulag's authorities. Now, because of the type of prisoners that the Gulag authorities were actually dealing with, I think that they would have had a shoot first, ask questions later type of mentality. But due to the injuries that were found on the skiers and due to the way that they had actually passed away, I just don't think that this theory is very likely, especially because of the fact that these guards would probably be carrying guns and things like that, and none of the skiers were found with gun wounds or anything of that kind of nature. So I just don't think that that theory is too believable, in my opinion. But again, if you guys have any other reason of why you think these 2 theories that I'm really just brushing the surface on could possibly be what happened, please let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to hear more about these 2 theories that I just talked about. A lot of people believe that this has KGB or CIA involvement. Now, something that I think I might have forgotten to mention is that when the skiers' bodies were discovered and taken back to the lab and tests were run on them, all of their bodies were found to be radioactive, and all of their clothing were also found to be radioactive, as well as the area in which their bodies were discovered. So many people believe that the CIA or the KGB were testing some kind of nuclear weapons up there, and that this is what caused the skiers' deaths, and this would explain why all of their clothing and whatnot was found to be radioactive. There's also another theory that kind of goes along hand in hand with this one that suggests that the skiers' hike into the mountain could have been some kind of secret mission by the KGB or the CIA, or just something secret that was set up by the military, and that maybe even the skiers didn't have any idea exactly what was going on. Now, an interesting fact that goes along with this theory, and this is not speculation, this is fact. Semyon was actually the oldest of the group, and he was a last-minute add-on and had extensive military training. He also had a tattoo on him which read, and I'm just going to look down for a minute because there's no possible way that I could have remembered this, but it read DAERMMUAZUAYA. And according to those who have extensively researched this tattoo, there is absolutely no translation to this and no meaning for this tattoo at all that searchers could find. So it is widely speculated that this could be some kind of secret military tag or that of a secret society of some sort that he could have been involved in. And maybe that is why he was so eager to get onto this trip, even though he was the last add-on. Maybe he had some kind of ulterior motive and bad intents to go on this trip with the group of skiers. But if there is absolutely any truth to this theory, why they would have sent them all out to the mountains, especially without their knowledge, is completely unknown. Another theory that was speculated, but again has absolutely zero back, is that maybe the skiers were a victim to an attack by the Manzi tribe. Now, this just doesn't seem to be something that a lot of people believe, because the Manzi tribe is actually a very, very peaceful, non-violent group of people, and they have zero interest in anything to do with the outside world. So why would a tribe of completely non-violent, very peaceful people go out of their way to come across a group of skiers and then attack them so violently for no reason? And how would they have so much technology to be able to kill them in such a clean fashion? I want to say clean because a lot of them died from hypothermia, but their injuries were very odd. So yeah, that one just doesn't really make sense to me, but it is something that is speculated by a few people. I don't think it is as widely believed as some of the other theories, but it is still something that people do talk about online. The next theory is one that seems more reasonable than the other ones. It doesn't involve aliens or anything paranormal or anything like that, but it does involve a lot of scientific knowledge. Now, I personally am not good at science. I don't understand how a lot of things work, so I'm going to try and explain this theory to you guys with the best of my ability with the research that I did online for this video. The theory is that there was some kind of fluctuation in gravity that caused the death of these 9 skiers. Now, I'm not really sure how that would work, but it is said that this has happened before. So this theory goes that maybe there was some kind of dramatic fluctuation in gravity, and that where the skiers had set up camp was right in the center of this. Now again, this has scientifically been proven to happen, although there isn't much known about this phenomenon. But according to scientists who do strongly believe this theory, they say that it would explain the strange way that the bodies had been discovered. So the way that this theory goes is that the first group of people who had left the camp were sucked into some kind of non-gravitational area, and they died instantly. Now the reason that this would have happened is because they would have been sucked out into that area as if they were inside a vacuum cleaner. And with this theory, it is believed that the other group of people had actually been dragged out of the tent. Now that would actually explain the tear from the inside of the tent, because the people who were inside of the tent would have literally been ripped out of the tent by gravity. Scientists have also come out and said that this phenomenon actually happens more than people realize, but the reason that it isn't studied too intensely and the reason that people don't know about it is because it happens in places that aren't really inhabited by people. So usually people aren't in the center of it, like it is believed in this theory that the skiers were. But another thing is, if this theory is true, scientists again who have studied this case say that if all of the skiers had remained inside of the tent, it is likely that this wouldn't have affected them at all. Now, I kind of touched roughly on the fact that a lot of people also believe that this could have been the result of some kind of weapons testing done by the Soviet military. Again, this is a theory that is often speculated by many people, because if they were going to test weapons, it is likely that they would do it away from civilization, somewhere like in the mountains. The Soviet authorities allegedly have also been really hush-hush about this case, which suggests to some that they know more than they have let on, and the fact that they haven't released all of the information to the public even after all of this time strikes a lot of people as quite odd. Yudin, the skier who I had mentioned earlier in this case, who had actually left the trek on January 28, 1959, would have likely have fallen victim to whatever his friends had fallen victim to if he hadn't become ill that day. But lucky for him, he actually lived to be 75 years old and passed away just recently in 2013. My heart sincerely goes out to the loved ones and the families of all of these 9 skiers. It is so tragic to me that it has been so long and they are left with absolutely zero answers to what happened to their loved ones. I just can't even wrap my mind around that. It is so tragic to lose somebody that you love, but to have no idea what happened to them or why they were left in that state would just be so frustrating and heartbreaking. But due to as long as this case has gone unsolved, and the reason that it just doesn't seem to have any explanation of what could have possibly happened, I do think that it is likely that we will never know what actually happened on the mountain that night. But guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!